Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's acting webinar, Transformative Resistance, Engaging Marginalized Groups for a Just Green Transition. My name is Vasya Madesi, and I'm delighted to guide you through today's session on behalf of the Acting project team and Yellow Window. Acting, for starters, is an Horizon 2020 project that explores how social inequalities intersect with climate action and how more inclusive policies and practices can be developed to support just environmental transitions. Today's webinar is part of our final series of thematic events, sharing key research insights. We'll explore today how resistance from quiet acts of everyday force and defiance to collective mobilization can act as a powerful force for environmental justice. And we'll hear also about our recommendations and examples from Turkey, Hungary, and Italy, as well as policy reflections for inclusive climate governance. Thank you for everyone who has joined us today. Whether you're a policymaker, a practitioner, an activist, a researcher, we're looking forward to your questions and reflections later in the discussion. Before we begin, just a quick note that the session is being recorded and the video will be made available via the Acting YouTube channel. Only the speaker interventions will appear in the final version. So if you have any questions at any time, feel free to use the Zoom chat or the Q&A box in any case. So let's get started. I will now hand the floor to Dr. Esin Düzel from Sabancı University, who will briefly introduce the key insights from the Acting fact sheet on transformative resistance. So I will stop sharing my screen, and Esin, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Vasya. Greetings, everyone. I'm Esin, and I'm from Sabancı University in Turkey. It's great to be here today with you to talk about this issue, transformative resistance, that actually we did not know when we started the project that we would focus on this question, on this issue of transformative resistance. But as we continued our research into very different sites within the European Green Deal, we have encountered several cases of resistance, and we collectively thought, how could we make resistance more visible, but on the other hand, a way of a participant of the transformations we are seeking with Green Deal. That's why we have amplified this topic with an open studio that we organized, that we collectively thought, and then from that open studio process, we wrote a fact sheet, which is our topic and our focus today. I would like to highlight that I have had great co-authors of this fact sheet. So Sofia Stret, Caroline Zorel, Marina Kakace, and Burcu Borhan Güreli have contributed to the fact sheet. We have written it together. Before going into details about the recommendations, specific recommendations that we wrote in the fact sheet, I would like to give you a brief background to how we came to this, how we have identified resistance, what sort of sub-themes have emerged among our research, among our wide-ranging research. So here are some of the paths we have arrived at with resistance. We have found a lot of cases of resistance that happened due to structural inequalities. We have found several ways in which vulnerable communities are locked in structural conditions that reproduce their vulnerabilities, and without intervention through social support mechanisms and specific policies promoting social equality and equity, these conditions really left little room for behavioral change within the communities and institutions. We have several examples of this, how structural inequalities led people to practices of resistance. I'd like to identify just briefly a few of them. For example, in Amadora, a suburban district in the southeast of Lisbon, Portugal, there's a migrant population and they live in segregated neighborhoods alongside their country of origin, language, and religion, and crisscross with a series of valleys and rivers. This neighborhood is particularly vulnerable to flash floods. And the dense neighborhood is also vulnerable to heat waves. And many people live in precarious, unplanned housing that lacks sanitary infrastructure, exposing them to extreme heat and cold, and they're unable to adjust their housing to the new weather conditions. And the researchers in Portugal, our colleagues, have found that despite being constructed without proper permissions and despite the experienced threats of climate-induced disasters, people living in these neighborhoods took pride in their housing, took pride in maintaining them for years, and they resist to relocation. These researchers have found this resistance stem from limited options, such as economic difficulties of moving to another neighborhood and the lack of social support, and also them being reliant on the social safety nets in their neighborhoods also made it really hard for them to choose to move elsewhere. Another case of resistance was in biodiversity conservation in Romania. Our researchers identified cases of illegal logging and extractive use of environmental resources. Despite their awareness of the harm that their practices pose to the forest, for instance, and to biodiversity, this remained the only option, or one of the very limited options for these people living in that particular district. This is a context in which unemployment rates have risen by 10%. It's an aging population, and many people live in subsistence economy. So making these structural conditions made it really hard for people to choose biodiversity over their means of living. We identified several cases of resistance to top-down policies. People really reacted harshly to the decision-making processes that they regarded as top-down, that disregarded their capacity to act and disregarded their insights about their own lives. For example, in Turkey, we identified a change in law where forest villagers who were previously were obliged to help in forest fire situations were reduced to volunteers with the change of law in 2007. With the change, they were no longer recognized as active participants in forest fire prevention and intervention, but they were equalized with people like volunteers who did not live in the area. And the resistance to top-down policies was strongly present also in the resistance to car-free policies. This was something that emerged very strongly in many cases, but also in Italy. Policies restricting private car use through designating green belt low emission zones sparked a lot of protests in a disadvantaged neighborhood on Rome's periphery. Without considering the social and economic vulnerabilities of the communities in the suburb, the policy exacerbated the inequalities by restricting car access for marginalized residents who cannot afford to replace their cars without providing adequate alternatives. hence their resistance. Some other causes of resistance are related to gender-based norms and other cultural forms and norms and political polarization. An example to gender-based norms would be how the prevalence of patriarchal norms made people identify or establish notions of physically reproduce the gender binaries with climate change policies. For instance, some individuals, our researchers have identified, still hesitate to use tricycles as a more sustainable mode of transport for fear of being perceived as so-called old or so-called weak. This hesitance stems from cultural norms prioritizing traditional two-wheeled bicycles and viewing tricycles as symbols of dependence rather than valid options for accessible transportation. Being mindful of time, I would like to move forward to our recommendations. So these recommendations address policymakers, but we are also happy to open this to civil society organizations and to larger public, because they really highlight the importance of acknowledging the perspective of marginalized groups. And we highlight the importance of learning from marginalized groups, inspiring examples and practices of resistance, resilience, and sustainability. We really push forward for an understanding these resistances as sources and agents of change for generating better policy. We organized the fact sheet around 3 subcategories, 3 ways of understanding and engaging with resistance. The first has to do with acknowledging and understanding resistance. We have written that, we have proposed that policymakers need to acknowledge and understand resistance within its unique context. Every resistance is different, and in order to really be able to engage with it, first policymakers step back and understand the unique conditions of resistance. 2, the other recommendation has to do with how policymakers can explore the vulnerabilities and the positions of the resisting actors and use this as a way to map the power relationships in a certain context and understand the complex agencies of disadvantaged groups. This is important in 3 ways. Of course, we are not asking policymakers to turn into social scientists, though they can, of course, use our insights. But these, to point out the fact that the resistances are also the places where complex power dynamics within groups surface, and how agencies within disadvantaged groups can be quite various. And in order for a policy to really be understood and not resisted, the policymakers need to understand these different dimensions of a community in place. The other chunk of the second chunk of recommendations has to do with the ways that policymakers can engage with resistance. And we have here the most crowded source of part. We have 6 recommendations here. And this is really about this set of recommendations is really about how to better engage, how to better understand and also establish platforms of dialogue with vulnerable groups and their resistance. So we point out to the fact that in our third recommendation, we point to the fact that policymakers can establish permanent platforms for dialogue and policy co-design between stakeholders and ensure these platforms' inclusivity and sustainability. And we emphasize that it's important to avoid a top-downness of such platforms. It's important to be, as inclusive, meaningfully inclusive as possible. And we also underline that these platforms need to be permanent. The following fact sheet has to do with, again, asking policymakers to employ tools for facilitation, conflict resolution, and dialogue building. We do not imagine resistance can be engaged quite straightforwardly, but instead we think it's very important to, use the existing tools, especially within civil society, to better to improve the engagement so that conflict resolution and dialogue building becomes really transformative. The other important fact sheet, in my opinion, the policy recommendation, in my opinion, is that policymakers can engage with resisting marginalized communities and people by leveraging their networks, resources, and wisdom. And this is really about making the marginalized group the real agents of change. And it's a way for policymakers to really understand what kind of resources, what kind of community networks, what kind of safety nets, what kind of practices of solidarity exist within marginalized communities, and how can they be leveraged for green policies. Therefore, the other recommendation has to do with policymakers making or turning or channeling resistance into a path for community empowerment. Sometimes we acknowledge resistance can be based on unequal access to information, knowledge, and confidence to navigate new situations. Therefore, capacity building, empowerment, community resilience can really unlock the situations of resistance. And the final recommendation in this subset is something that we discussed a lot. It's about identifying silent resistances. We discuss a lot whether, and this might be something that we can also discuss after our speakers' reflections, can we imagine all resistance being resolved? Can we think of resistance as something that is remaining? And what if we ask constantly whose voice is missing? What if we constantly seek for those resisting voices? Maybe they are resisting in silence. So how can we really engage with those kinds of resistances? The final subset of recommendations has to do with recommendation, actually, it's a single one, has to do with identifying long-term solutions to complex issues. We think that resistances can be starting points for making sustainability transformations, help social questions resolution, such as how the insights gained from resistance can contribute to long-term solutions for complex matters such as human rights, social equity, cultural heritage protection, and safety from natural hazards. In our fact sheet, we have quite rich sets of findings from ACCTING and very inspiring stories from our research that I really, really encourage you to visit. And you can see the link of the fact sheet here in this slide. So without further ado, Vasya, on to you.
Thank you so much, Esin, for this presentation of the fact sheet. Indeed, you have set the scene and you have highlighted the importance of resistance. And also one of the final recommendations, I have the impression it was also one of the key takeaways of the final conference of acting, to hear the silent voices. Thank you so much for this presentation. Now, I'm delighted to welcome our first speaker, who is Dr. Ana Maria Vargas Fala. Ana Maria is an expert in participatory governance and sustainability transition, and her work has brought valuable frameworks for understanding resistance as a catalyst for systemic change. Ana Maria, we're very happy to have you with us. You may go ahead with a short presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Vasya, and I think that I'm very honored to be here as well, because your project is extremely inspiring, and reading this policy brief that you just presented us in, I could just identify with so many of the recommendations and the wonderful stories that you share. So I think that the work that I will share today connect to two things. One is the quiet resistance, the one that is more silent. And we wrote an article called Quiet Resistance Speaks, where we highlight when quiet becomes not so quiet, but that requires a different level of a different approach. It's not a protest, it requires a different way to engage. And the second part that I think I would like to contribute to your discussion is the role of the law. So I'm a sociologist of law, and we study a lot. We have seen in the last years how the production of climate-related laws at all levels, from international law to national laws, plans, to local governance and local governments bylaws. So this is what I would like to discuss briefly here today. And we produce an animated video based on our research. And so I will start asking Vasya to share this video, and then I would end up with some remarks.
Just give me a second, so I'm certain that I'm sharing also the sound of the video. Okay, share sound.
Climate change is a reality for many communities around the world. Rising sea levels, stronger storms, and severe droughts have forced governments and international agencies to propose climate adaptation measures, like seawalls, drought-resistant crops, and even relocation. But for many, these top-down approaches don't always align with their needs, values, or even their legal rights. Take the example of Cartagena, Colombia. Here, in an informal settlement, residents face severe flooding risks. The law declares this area a high-risk zone, which means no improvements can be made and homes should be dismantled. But many residents of these settlements have a different vision of climate adaptation. They resist these legal restrictions. They mobilized local organizations, planted mangroves to stabilize the coastline, and demanded better living conditions right where they are. This is not just a social resistance, but a legal one, a defiance against laws that they feel strip them of their dignity and rights. For them, climate adaptation isn't about compliance, it's about justice, the right to stay, and the right to protection from climate loss. Our review of the literature shows similar stories from around the world. In the Pacific Islands, for years, rising sea levels have threatened the very existence of their residents. Many legal frameworks already treat them as climate refugees, but the Pacific Warriors, a group of activists, reject this label. They demand dignified migration and the right to stay on their lands. They're not sinking, they're fighting. Their resistance isn't just cultural or political, it's legal too. This adds to a growing number of cases where people challenge international laws that fail to recognize their sovereign human rights and fight for adaptation strategies that honor their identity and their right to self-determination. Then there are farmers in drought-prone regions who are encouraged, even legally pressured, to plant drought-resistant crops. But they resist. On the edges of their farms, they experiment with these new seeds, but inside, they continue with traditional farming methods that have sustained their communities for generations. For these farmers, resistance is not about denying climate change. It's about resisting laws and policies that threaten their autonomy and their way of life. They argue that traditional crops taste better and are part of the culture, while shifting to the new crops require additional invisible labor. These examples show that resistance to climate adaptation isn't just about saying no. It's about challenging laws and policies that disregard local voices. It's about using non-compliance as a political voice, a way to demand adaptation plans that consider their lived experiences. Resistance has its limits. It can put people at legal and personal risk and doesn't always lead to immediate change. But it does reveal the power of communities to shape their own futures. It calls for policymakers to rethink the legal frameworks around climate adaptation and to listen, truly listen, to those on the front lines. Because adaptation is not just about surviving climate change, it's about living with dignity, justice, and the freedom to shape one's own destiny. Policymakers should engage in dialogue with loud protesters, but also with those that quietly resist.
Thank you, Basia. I think this film really, I hope it resonates and to what you've been doing. Our focus was mainly on this quiet resistance, but when we started, we were really inspired by what is the role of the law, like what is the role of the law in climate change adaptation. And when you read the IPCC report, law is mentioned not so much, a couple of times, but what it says is it highlights a positive view on the role of the law. It says the law can facilitate climate action in multiple ways. For instance, guiding behavior, coordinating action, enforcing. So here we see the sticky part of the law, climate response, and it can also be symbolic. And what we see is across jurisdictions, as I was mentioning, many new laws being enacted about climate change. We see also a rise of climate litigation around the world, so the courts are being used. But we thought about, so what about marginalized groups and everyday citizens? The relationship with the law is not the one that we assume that they will go and influence the law policymakers and participate in the discussions of the law. They also don't use the courts. Like courts require knowledge, resources. They can be a burden actually on the people that go to the courts. But that doesn't mean that they are first climate deniers. That's one of the arguments that we are rejecting, of course. That doesn't mean that they are only coping. And here I want to challenge you a little bit with your, one of the results that you said is because of the lack of options. So one of the theses is that people stayed in these places because there are no options or they lack options. But we want to challenge that and say that, and also what you were mentioning as in at the end, like what do we do with the resistors that do not want to, I mean, that when after the dialogue, they are still resisting. Because, so what we said is that resistance is not something that necessarily should be overcome. And our argument is that it's a form of political engagement. So in this world where most ordinary citizens and marginalized groups actually, they are, how do you say, enchanted with democracy, with elections, with politicians in general, resistance is a form of political engagement. It shows their political voice and their agency. And what we argue is that these top-down laws have failed to reflect the lived experiences, the needs, and the priorities of affected citizens. And we could stay there in the resistance, but in the article of the Quiet Resistance Speaks, we argue that actually resistance can be transformational in the sense that it can lead to outcomes. So we try to study the outcomes of this quiet resistance. Studying the outcomes is very difficult because it often takes a long time. Plus, it says quiet resistance is not something that you can do this like tracing directly. But we look into different things and we saw some outcomes from resistors actually be suffering because of the resistance. So we are not glorifying resistance. They put themselves at risk, and they have to pay an extra cost because of the resistance, such as experiencing hunger, more extreme hunger during the hungry season. But slowly, if we move up the ladder of these outcomes of resistance, we saw in many cases is about autonomy and dignity. So even about the possibility to say, just no, this is not our way of life. This is not what we want, to not having to be, co-opted by the state legal institutions. We look at their outcomes in terms of defending the territory. So many people that live in these informal settlements, they are able to stay for many, many years. This is the only way they can access actually property rights on the long term. The resistance has led to project change, like they resisted, so they actually, once implementing the adaptation project, has to change the project because otherwise it was useless. It led to project failure as well, which I think, okay, is that good project failure? But project failure, it's, and when we read the reports about how many adaptation projects are failing, it creates a consequence, right? Then it shows that something is wrong. Making the law obsolete is something that we look a lot, like how law is in paper, but in practice, there is non-compliance, it doesn't really work. Increased political recognition, and finally shifting global narratives, like we saw with the case of the Pacific climate warriors. So we look at the law with two angles. One is the legal pluralism, and legal pluralism assumes that there is possible in society not only one law, the law of the state, and everybody should abide to this law, but instead that there are different regulatory systems and normative systems that operate and coexist with the state law. So that sometimes we find these alternative ways of regulating behavior that are important. And we look also into the concept of legal consciousness. And it's about by speaking about how people experience the law in their daily lives, we understand their resistance. I want to finalize saying something a little bit about what the law can do in practice. Of course, the law can empower by bringing rights. People can talk about, I have right to compensation because of this flooding event, or but the law can also repress. It can criminalize the actions of these resistors, and it can lead to corporate capture. And what is interesting is to understand how people, the resistors, navigate this, because they have big agency and they are aware of what's happening. And to finalize, also, I want to say something that came to my thoughts. Our research, I indirectly your research, because it's the same kind of research, I think, was highlighted last year as one of the 10 insights in climate science, where they selected like 10 pressing issues that are upcoming in climate science. And our insight was about popular resistance or support to climate policies. And we are seeing a big backlash where even the Green Deal is now questioned and a table. We see how I'm in Portugal right now, and then they have national elections on Sunday, and the green parties and the green issues are not in the agenda of the electorates. We're losing the ordinary citizens. And I don't think we're losing the ordinary citizens because they are climate denials or because they don't see the importance. We're losing the ordinary citizens, and they are resisting these policies because we are not listening to what their needs are. And we're not listening to how they experience these laws. And in these insights, we saw that fairness is a very important issue. The cost of climate adaptation policies is given equally to everybody in society, while rich people, big polluters, are not paying the cost. So people are resisting with reason, and I think resistance can help us to understand better these climate policies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ana Maria, also for challenging the work that we have done. That's why we have this discussion. It was very insightful. Now, I'm happy also, before we move on to the exchange between you and also the Q&A, to our second speaker, Dr. Hikmet Batuhan Günsen, who is an environmental scientist and active member of the Foresters Association of Turkey. Batuhan has worked closely with forest villager cooperatives and brings an invaluable field perspective to the discussion. So Batuhan, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Vezia, and greeting dear all. First of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me as a speaker. It's actually it's an honor for me. Nowadays, the decisions of policymakers alone are not enough to combat and adapt to climate crisis. And it's very important to ensure the participation of marginalized groups such as local peoples, indigenous peoples, or forest villagers in all processes related to climate crisis. In fact, the participation of the marginalized group has been frequently mentioned issue since the 1992 Rio conference. In addition, sometimes marginal groups may resist the implementation of unilateral decisions made by policymakers. So the finding of the acting project give us clues not to break the resistance but to transform it. And it's really important not break the resistance but to transform it. I think as seen and her colleagues put on the most important context, and it is transformative resistance. Because of transformative resistance, I think important to correct policies. Um, so. I think some policy recommendation caught my attention in their fact sheet. Actually, I would like to point them out. My favorite recommendation are 2, 4, and 7, and I I think these recommendations are extraordinary, and they cannot easily this recommendation different policy recommendation, and actually um, uh, Esin point out this recommendation, 8 recommendation, her presentation, but I am aware of this uh, recommendation. When I read the fact sheet, and the lighting in my mind, actually. And first of all, recommendation 2 is interesting. For example, policymakers can explore the vulnerabilities and the positions of the resisting actors. Actually, first of all, um, I have a question in my mind. Who is the policymakers? Who are the policymakers? Actually, the answer of this question in Turkey uh, of public officer public officer are policymakers. Um, so I think learning the weakness of the disadvantaged groups, like first villagers, indigenous peoples, etc., is the first and most important step in development. And it's important for policymakers to collaborate with researchers and NGOs to understand local resistance and offer the right solution. Actually, there are several and diversity research in the all of the world about the local people, indigenous people, but most of time policymakers cannot cannot constrain this finding of the research. So therefore, recommendation 2 is important. And another important recommendation for me, recommendation for, and when the process encounters obstacles or stagnation, it's crucial to remain patient, flexible, and open to innovation solution. Um, and I think it is very important for me, this sentence, by viewing tensions as opportunities for untapped potential and valuable insights. Policymakers can foster mutual from transformation and growth. Tensions can hold opportunities that hold untapped potential and valuable insight. Actually, this is like a um, mm, not empty glass, but full glass, I think. And because of if if policymakers change their perspectives or views, um, they can see the different opportunities for the correct and stand my favorite recommendation in the fact sheet. It is seven. Policymakers can also learn from the disadvantaged groups who don't who do not resist the ask, who voice is missing, to hear the voice of those who do not speak. I think it is really important, and I believe that this policy recommendations are extraordinary, and I think they are important. Yes, all of the recommendation are important, but I think these three recommendation caught my attention. Actually, I how can I say? Actually, I have some idea for improvement this picture. If first of all, if we are talking about climate crisis, policy makers must be objectives, and they have equal distance for all interest groups, especially vulnerable groups or marginalist groups, and because of climate change concern all people and the even living things all in the world, and maybe maybe should be pointed this fact sheet, this topics, and um, another thing, recommended policies should be sustainable. Um, um, what I say about, even if policymakers change, recommended policies should not change except for improvements of the recommended policy. And maybe um, to write this fact sheet and policy recommendation in the future, maybe should be organized a different workshop and with public agencies, because of, as I told you, policymakers mostly are public officers, and this fact sheet should be sent them, because of, I think we are part of the policy make process, and I think this is important. And thank you. I want to say another thing. When I see and check the fact sheet, especially graphics and another page designs caught my attention. Actually, I can easily read this fact sheet and understand very well. And thank you for preparation team. And thank you for all for thank you.
Thank you, Batu, and thank you, Ana Maria, for these very helpful, interesting, challenging, inspiring reflections on the fact sheet. It seems like Ana Maria helped us stay a bit more with this uncomfortable question of whose voice is missing and what if resistance is not transformed? What do we do? Thanks for making us stay on that point further, and the video was beautiful. I look forward to disseminating it, of course. And Batuhan also helped us think with the questions of engagement and dialogue building and how policymakers can be addressed. And I think your reminder about the internal diversity of policymakers was an important one, how policymakers are not an homogeneous group, but there are differences among policymakers, and how tensions, what do we do with tensions? Again, like thinking of this transformative aspect. Yeah, with one speaker, we stayed more on the question of resistance, and with the other speaker more on the transformation, which is great. Thank you very much. You have already said a few things about how you would like to challenge it and what you would like about the recommendations. Please feel free to say more on them. But I was also thinking if you have any suggestions on how to improve the fact sheets, if you have particular suggestions about, making this fact sheet more resonant, like how to make policymakers hear these recommendations. If you have any suggestions on that, that would be great. And also, if you have any experiences or cases you have run into where this the interaction, the dialogue, engagement between resistant parties and policymakers have happened. If you know any examples of that, that would be great to hear. And then we can also open the floor for Q&A. Whoever would like to start, please go ahead.
Thank you. I can start
Yes.
if you want. I really like the recommendations, and I particularly like the recommendation 5 and 7. The 5 was about the networks, and I think that many times we don't know what to do, how to address the resistance, where to start, and politicians want to have simple, easy solutions that are actionable. Like we researchers, we complicate things, but for the politicians, it's impossible. So I think this is a very concrete recommendation on how they can engage with the resistors through like those already actors that are a little bit organized and a little bit mobilized. That's one. In the work that I'm doing now here with these other colleagues on another project, they tried is about participatory governance, and we have tried all kind of methods that you imagine, like participatory budgeting and like all possible engagements to like really innovations and deep level. And at the end, in some spaces, so hard, so difficult. So they suggested to work with champions, so that because people that are organized is easy to reach, but these individuals that are not organized, that are really like more spread, that quiet resistors, to find champions that in those communities that can engage with the discussion. And I think that the key about democracy is that when it doesn't work, you should not eliminate it. You should work further. And the most important on democracy is dialogue. So different innovations for enhancing dialogue. And also we experienced that in many of our innovations, nothing happened at the end. There were no results, or the local government simply rejected the suggestion from the civil society and kept another thing. But I think dialogue in itself, like the process in itself, is so important. So we shouldn't forget that actually having the dialogue is already the transformation. And this could be like very good in your policy brief. On the who is missing, I also thought this was very excellent recommendation, the 7, and asking actors about who is missing. So I think this is a very concrete something that can be done. And maybe one recommendation that I thought it was more difficult was the number 2 about mapping power. And I think maybe this is something that politicians don't do. They don't go around mapping power. This is something we do, the researchers. So try to think about what is something that they do. They want to talk to people, they want to engage in dialogues that they want to implement things, and they want small gains that they can show that they are proud. Otherwise, only just discussions. So not underestimating the smaller steps towards transformation. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Those are very helpful insights and suggestions. Batuhan, do you have any ideas about how these can be improved, or any cases of existing good dialogue or permanent engagement?
Actually, the resistance is the part of the democracy, and really, and maybe you can share this fact sheet for different policymakers groups. For example, political parties and related climate crisis related the public institutions. For example, General Directorate of Forestry in Turkey, agriculture and forestry administration in Turkey, because of policymakers work at these institutions, and actually better stories in the fact sheet are enough for me, but to share this fact sheet is important. I look at this screen, and I see different people from NGOs and universities, but I think the political parties and other policymakers is weak in this webinar. So you can share this fact sheet with policymakers. Thank you.
Yes, that we will definitely do. And also the recording of this event for sure. We can open the floor for audience questions. If you have any questions, you can unmute yourself and ask your question. Yeah, the challenge I hear both from Anna Maria's reflections and Batuhan's reflections is how to make a shift in the policymakers' perspectives so that they do not see failure as the failure, but stay with the trouble, stay with the problem, the resistance, and really find a way to get into it, how to really I mean, one part of this fact sheet is about convincing the policymakers that there is really a lot of there are really a lot of things to learn from resistance. So, you know, try to dig in. And the other one is just like, of course, the political process is different, but what if there is no gain at the moment? So how can you continue the process? What kind of pathways are there? Yeah, Francesca has a question. Go ahead, Francesca.
Yeah, thanks for this presentation. It was really, really interesting. I have a question for Anna Maria, and I was thinking about the quiet resistance, but I was thinking also about people that are quiet not because they resist, but because they just feel that the problems do not affect them. Maybe because they don't have the resources, maybe because they are not reached by information from the policies. And from the policymakers, so they just receive the policies without really understanding that they were part of them, and how you think we can address them, because you are talking about people that they are quiet, but they know exactly what they want, let's say, or maybe that's what I understood, or maybe you can clarify that. But I was wondering about those people that instead they just don't know because they don't have the resources also to engage with those policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca. Very good question. I think that I can give two examples. The one of the informal settlements in Cartagena, I think that you could maybe think that they don't have the resources, they don't know what's going on, but they are affected by the problem. So when we were there, we didn't ask them about what do you think about this policy, but what problems you have. And starting with the problems they have and the issues they were experiencing, we start like tying the dots to that, it's because they don't have rights to the land. It's because there is no school nearby. And why is there not a school? Okay, this is a flooding area. Or, I cannot go to work. My house is destroyed. And well, they really were experiencing these heavy flooding events. But in this project that we are working now on nature-based solutions, in Europe, actually what we're seeing is groups that are entirely not interested. Like even they know and even they are there. And one of the groups is the youth. We've been trying to engage with youth in so many different ways. We only succeed when it's inside institution, in the high schools, in the kindergartens. We even engage with children, or at the university. But youth, and like more before they are at the university and when they are in the high school, no, not interest. Like there is no, we do events, we do barbecues, we do parties, festivals, no interest. So I don't have an answer, but we are challenged by this.
And if you, maybe also, this is also for the audience, if you have any examples of where these platforms for dialogue is established in a very innovative, inclusive, transformative way, because that was a challenge for us. That was not something that we necessarily did the research about. That's why, I mean, I cannot say that we exhausted all our resources for that. But in the cases that we saw tensions, conflicts, resistance, hesitance, foot dragging, you know, all these colors of resistance, it was really hard to find cases where resistance is engaged meaningfully and a dialogue platform, engagement platform was established. I mean, we write that, you know, policymakers can make good use of all the deep democracy methods, facilitation methods, whatnot, but we suspect that there's a long way to do there. So yeah, we can stay with this question.
I don't know, but this project that I am now is about like this innovative co-creation governance approaches, where the idea is to co-create nature-based solutions with marginalized and vulnerable groups. And the whole project talks about absence, who is absent. So it's like your idea about where voices are missing. Has been our question constantly. And we had the two spectrums, like some projects that have done workshops with prisons, workshops with Roma communities, and trying to engage with migrants without papers, like the most extreme vulnerable groups, without being able to lead sometimes to results. And we were just discussing that today, that engaging is already a transformation, engaging in the dialogue and having those voices on the table and having those voices heard. And I experienced once in Colombia, in Bogota, like I studied street vendors and informal economic activities that local governments just want to get rid of because it's considered as a problem. They don't pay taxes. It's a nuisance. Mess. And then the mayor engaged in a very long process of dialogue with the vendors, trying to first form organizations and trying to design programs and projects that would fit to the realities. And the process was amazing democratically. But the results, I studied the results, and it was so limited because the city had about 100,000 street vendors. Like, it's huge. It's 10 million people, 100,000 street vendors.
Oops. Did we lose Ana Maria? Looks like it.
And from the process, they created these streets. They did not one. What did I? Did you lose me?
Yes, we lost
Am I
you
back?
after you said like
Oh.
there's like 100,000 street vendors.
Yes. Okay. So 100,000 street vendors and a very limited political possibility to even do anything. So they created a pilot project. It was wonderful. It was street rotating markets. They put something like a human vending machine program for elderly people to sell snacks and coffee inside government buildings. Beautiful things. But I counted, and the maximum number they achieved was 1,700, maybe 2,000 people involved. Then what about the 98,000 that are outside? Those were never going to be reached. And many people were people that were rural migrant immigrants. They were not even a population that is registered. They come one day, they leave the other day. So I think we can do a lot of things with participation, but sometimes we just have to accept this kind of also alternative ways.
Yeah, we might consider rewriting these recommendations based on every different vulnerable group, right? According to their and for every context that they can be adjusted. I think hearing from both of you, it's been very enriching. Thank you. Do we have any other questions from the audience to our speakers? We have had Ana Maria talk. So if you have any questions to Batuhan, maybe. If not, we can also conclude our session.
Actually, I want to think something. Actually, when we look at the laws, development programs, and other sectors programs, we can see good recommendations about climate crisis, sustainable forest management, etc. But in implementation, unfortunately, policymakers didn't see this recommendation. Maybe we can say about implementation of this recommendation. Maybe they, policymakers and others, they put on the center of laws and development, etc., development plans. And so, if even if policymakers change, and then if different policymakers came the governments, every policymakers follow this recommendation. Actually, as I told you, sustainability of the recommendation is important. Yes, maybe in the process, this recommendation can be changed, but I think sustainability is important in this process. Sustainability actually it is not a context, I think, and we use this context both forestry and in policy. But I think this is my mind, my idea, and thank you.
Thank you, Batuhan. It's a great reminder also to make these texts, these policy recommendations, etc., also accessible to vulnerable groups so that they can use this as part of their advocacy efforts. So they can say that, okay, there are these sets of policy recommendations developed by researchers in a European Union supported project. So what do you think? You know, they say engage with resistance. So how do you think we can further this? So policymakers address our fact sheets, address policymakers, but it, of course, vulnerable groups, resistant groups, it would be great if they also use them. And thank you very much. Batuhan has also mentioned this, that infographics are done by our wonderful colleagues at Yellow Window in Belgium. And the design of the fact sheet is done by our wonderful colleagues at the European Science Foundation in Strasbourg, I guess, right? So, Vasia, shall we conclude? How do you think?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, everyone, both our speakers, to you, Aysin, for this lovely coordination of the discussion. We heard really good examples, and I think we can start from here. And I'm happy that this has been recorded and will be shared on ACCTING's website and YouTube channel in the coming days. So if you'd like to stay in touch, you can follow us on our website, LinkedIn page for more webinars. We have one more webinar happening on the 22nd of May on more inclusive sustainability policies. So if you're interested, please register for this particular webinar. And yet again, thank you so much. And I wish you a great afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna Maria. Thank you, Batuhan.
Thank
Thanks
you.
a lot.
Thank you.